Welcome to this lecture on the CSS Box Model. In the last lecture we looked at borders and how we can add various styles of border to an HTML element such as dotted, dashed, solid and so on. In that lecture I touched briefly on how borders make an element larger, but in this lecture I'll go into more detail and look at how CSS handles content, padding, borders and margins in what it calls the box model. To start with, you need to be aware that CSS will treat every HTML element on a web page as a box. It doesn't matter which HTML tag is used to define an element. They each take up a rectangular block on the web page, and CSS will make sure that everything is positioned to give each element enough space. However, in order to work out just how much space each element requires, the browser needs to take several things into consideration. These consist of the element's content, any padding around it, any borders given to the element, and finally any margin placed around it. Collectively, all of these will determine how much space an HTML element takes up on a web page, and how the other elements around it are positioned. Here's an example of the box model that CSS will use when calculating space. The blue part in the center represents the content. This may be text, images, or may even be other HTML tags which reside within the element. For example, text placed within a p tag would be considered content, or an image placed within a div tag. The green area then represents any padding that's been applied around that content. Next, the yellow part represents the element's border, and finally, the orange part the margin which will appear around the element. All of these will be used to calculate how much space is required for the element. This may all sound very simple, but it's important that you know how each of these areas behave because some are visible areas and some are not. Also, some are used when determining an element's height and width, while again some are not. Finally, when using background images or colours, only certain areas will be filled. If you know which areas take part in what, then it will make your job much easier when structuring a web page. To make this process easier, let's test the box model out using some real HTML and CSS code. I'll start with a blank HTML file. I've included this file in your course downloads in the CSS Paddings, Margins and Box Model folder in the CSS section. Feel free to open this up yourself if you wish to code along. I'm going to use an HTML div tag to demonstrate the box model, as they're pretty easy to style. To start with, I'll create 3 div tags and just enter some basic content in each one. I'll also create some CSS rules to target these using ID selectors as we've discussed before, and I'll give each of them a different colour background so that we can see which is which. If I run this, we can see our 3 div elements sitting each on their own line, taking up the full width of the page, just as we'd expect from any block element like this. So far so good then. But in order to best demonstrate the box model, I want these elements to sit side by side. To do this, I'll add a new CSS rule to target all divs using a type selector. And in here, I'll ask that all divs float left. We've not covered the float property yet, so don't worry if this is new. We'll cover it in later lectures. For now though, all that you need to know is that it changes a div's behaviour from a block element to an inline element, and make sure that it positions itself as far to the left as it can on the current row based on the other elements around it. In our browser window, we can now see that our div elements sit flush alongside each other, and they only take up enough space to cater for the content within them. Note that there are no gaps between the content and the edges of the elements, nor are there any gaps between them. Basically, they're now behaving like an inline element. However, there's still a small gap between the elements and the edge of the page, but as we've seen before, this has nothing to do with the div tags. This gap is there because the body tag carries a default margin of its own. Let me just get rid of this because it's important that we don't have any row gaps in our test, as this may confuse things. To remove this gap, I'll create another CSS rule to target the body tag using a type selector, and this time I'll override the margin by setting it to 0. Now in our browser window, our 3 div elements sit right up at the top left corner of the page, and there's no gaps at all, either around them or between them. That's great, and it gives us a good base to start testing out the box model. Before we do though, let's just look at the box model illustration again, but in relation to the blue central div. If you're using Google Chrome as your browser, you can review the box model by right-clicking on the blue div element and selecting the Inspect option. Under the Styles tab within the Elements section, you'll see this box model illustration. Even though we've not specified a height and width, the browser has sized the div element according to its content, and in this case it's showing as having a value of 32 pixels by 18 pixels. The padding, border and margin though are all showing as having no values. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward, but let's now add some padding to see what this does. If we go back to the code and add the padding property with a value of 10 pixels, then refresh our browser, we can see that the browser has added that 10 pixels to each side, between the content and the edge. In the last lecture, we saw that we could specify 1, 2, 3 or 4 values to the border width property. Well, the padding property is no different. Because I've given it just one value though, the browser has applied it to all 4 sides. I won't go into the various padding properties right now, as it works in exactly the same way as the border width property, so this concept should be familiar to you already. I will put up a list of padding properties at the end of this lecture though, for your reference. Once again, before we add anything else, let's just take a quick look at the box model illustration to see how things have changed. As expected, we now have the same dimensions for the content area in blue, but the green padding area is now showing 10 pixels on all 4 sides. From this, we can see that the overall size of the div is now no longer just 32 pixels by 18, but it is in fact 32 pixels plus 20 pixels wide, by 18 pixels plus 20 pixels high. So that now makes the box 52 pixels wide and 38 pixels high. Adding the padding has made the div element larger. Next, let's go back and add a border element so that we can see where it sits in relation to the content and the padding. I'll use the shorthand border property because I want to add a border all the way around. As we saw in the last lecture, I can do this within the one border property, but supplying 3 values to represent the width, colour and style. If I refresh the browser window, we can see that our blue div element now has a thick black border all the way around it. However, it has retained the 20 pixel padding, so this border has been placed around what was already there and has made the element even larger. Finally, let's add a margin to the element. Just like the border and padding, the margin property will accept 1, 2, 3 or 4 values. I want a consistent margin around the whole element here, so I'll just specify one value of 10 pixels. If we run this again, we can now see a 10 pixel gap all the way around the element, outside of the border, padding and content. A quick look at the box model illustration again, and we can see that the orange area, which represents the margin, is now showing 10 pixels for all sides. Unlike with padding and border though, the addition of the margin has not made the actual div element any larger. It's still the same size as it was before, but it now has a gap between it and anything else on the page. This may seem insignificant, but it's important to note that margins don't change the element's size, like content, padding and borders do. Only the amount of space that the element takes up. You'll need to remember this when we come to size the elements manually in a moment. So then, let's just quickly look at what's visible and what's not. The content area, padding and borders all make up the visible portion of an element. The margin, however, does not. That is invisible and is just empty space around the element. Now let's look at the fill area. This is not a physical area shown in the box model illustration, but the fill area is what gets filled when you set an element's background color or image. In fact, we can already see it in our example. I set the background color property earlier, and as a result the browser has filled the div element in blue. However, it only filled the areas which represent the content and the padding. The border, while visible, is not fillable, and this is placed around the fillable areas. However, you can't fill the content and the padding areas separately, just in case you are wondering. The same would be true if we were to fill the element with an image using the background image property rather than background color. It too would only be visible within the content and padding areas. Images get a little more tricky though, as they're likely to be a different size to the element, and as such they won't always fit neatly into the space. However, there are other properties to help us handle this, and I'll cover those in later lectures, so we don't need to worry too much about background images right now. Okay, that's great, and hopefully it's helped to explain the box model. Now though, I would just like to show you an important property when it comes to situations where we manually set the dimensions of an element. Often, while creating the layout for a website, you'll need to make certain elements set sizes so that everything fits neatly together and looks good on the web page. However, when doing this with elements which have different paddings, borders and margins, it can become surprisingly tricky. This caught me out early on my coding journey, so let me spend a bit of time explaining why, so hopefully it won't catch you out too. Earlier, I said that you'll need to remember which properties make up an element's overall size, and this is where it becomes important. As mentioned earlier, the content, padding and border properties collectively all make up an element's overall size, with margins being placed outside of these. However, that's only in situations where the element has no set size. Without specific height and width properties, the browser will calculate the size of the content and we'll use that as the implied width and height values for the element's content area. This makes sure that the element is large enough to contain its content. If we set the height and width properties manually though, these values will override the size of the content and the browser will display the element to match the specified dimensions instead. To show you why this can become an issue, let me go back to the code and set the height and width properties for all three div elements. I'll set both height and width to 50 pixels for all three, but before I run it, you'd reasonably expect all three div tags to appear the same size on the page, right? Well, not quite. Let's run it so you can see what I mean. Here we can see the middle div element is clearly larger than the two on either side of it. But why is this happening when we told the browser they should all be 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels high? Well, it comes down to the padding and the borders that exist on the middle div element. By default, an element's overall size will take into account the content and padding area, and then the browser will add borders around those. When we set the size properties, we're telling the browser to size the content area to 50 pixels wide and high. Of course, it will then add the padding around that, and then the border around that again. So you can see how the overall size ends up being much larger than the 50 pixels that we specified. This is the default behavior for the box model, and as long as you know this and you know about the alternatives, then it shouldn't cause you too much trouble. So now that you know about the default behavior, let me share the alternative with you. The property that controls this behavior is called box sizing, and the default value for this is content box. This means that its content area is being sized when you set the dimensions via the width and height properties. The alternative value for this property is border box, and this changes the behavior so that any dimensions will get applied to the overall element, including content, padding, and any borders. If you're sizing elements for layout purposes, this option all of a sudden makes so much more sense, as it allows us to control how much space the overall element takes up, rather than just the content portion. To show you what I mean, let's go back to the code and set the box sizing property on the middle div element. Here we can see the two values that I mentioned listed in the drop-down IntelliSense menu, content box and border box. Remember that content box is the default value that will be used if this property is not specified, and it has resulted in the behavior that we've seen so far. Here though, I'm going to change this to the border box value instead. Now when I run it, we can see the blue div element in the middle is the same size as the two on the other side of it. All of the visible box model areas, which include border, padding and content, have now been sized so that they comply with our 50 pixel wide and high settings. As you can imagine, this makes aligning items on the page so much easier now that I have control over an element's overall size. Note that we still have a margin around the element, which is why it's positioned slightly lower than the other two. However, this makes sense as the margin is not really part of the element, and it relates to the gap around it, not an area within it. However, you may have noticed that the content now bleeds out of the element slightly, because 50 pixels is no longer large enough to contain it with the padding in place. But that's what happens when you manually size a div element to be smaller than its content. There are other properties which can be applied to a div tag to control what happens to overflowing content, such as making the content scroll or simply hiding anything that overflows. But we'll touch on those when we start to build a website in the project section of the course. Great, so that's given you a good insight as to how the box model is used within CSS to govern the size of elements and the various options that are available to you. We'll be using this quite a lot in the project section of the course. Before we move on though, let's look at an example website layout and how this box model applies to the elements within it. Here we can see a header bar, hero image, some feature icons, and then some content cards. Each of these elements is taking up its own rectangular space on the page, even the round ones. Each within its own box model which contains the area for content, padding, border and margin. Take the feature icons for example. Because they don't touch each other, we can assume that they have a margin around them. It's this margin that will create the gaps between them and the other elements around them. Each one can also have a border, and within that they may have some form of image-based content. They may or may not have padding between the content and the border, but the option would be there if you need it. The same would be true of any other elements on this page. Each one would have its own box model to control the size of the element and space around it. As you can see from this, the box model is therefore a very important part of CSS, and having gone through it in this lecture, it's hopefully an area that you now understand fairly well. If you wish to experiment with the box model yourself, then please feel free to load up the code and have a play with the various properties we've discussed in this lecture. I've saved a copy of the code file that we've been working on here in your course downloads, in the CSS padding, margins and box model folder within the CSS section. The file is called CSS Box Model example.html. Also, in that same folder, I've created another file which is an example of this website template. In there, each element has its own content, padding, borders and margins. So have a look at that one too so that you get the feel of how the box model affects a website's layout. Also, as promised earlier in the lecture, here's a very quick recap on the padding, border and margin properties. We used the shorthand versions in this example, but I just wanted to list the other properties that can be used to control these three box model areas. Feel free to pause the video here and take some time to familiarise yourself with the various options. We've touched on it briefly in this lecture when we looked at the fill area, but next up we'll look a little deeper into backgrounds. So when you're ready, head on over to the next lecture and we'll see how background images can be applied to elements and used alongside their content to create great looking components.